I almost threw it away. A plain white card, sitting in a drawer I hadn't touched in 6 years. No logo, no design. Just my name printed across the front in small, quiet letters. I had convinced myself it was worthless, that whatever was attached to it had already been taken, already been claimed by someone who made sure I walked away from my own family with nothing but a suitcase and a garbage bag. But something stopped me from throwing it out. And that something, that one small decision to hold on instead of let go, is the reason I'm standing here today, with a story I never thought I'd get to tell. My name is Stella Calloway. I'm 28 years old. And 6 years ago, I was handed that card at my parents' funeral by the sister who had just finished making sure I had no seat in the front row, no place in the will reading, and no home to go back to. She told me the card was probably empty. She said it like it was an afterthought. Like I was an afterthought. I believed her for 6 years. Then one Tuesday morning, I walked into Heritage Trust Bank to cancel it for good, slid it across the counter to a teller named Diane Foster, and watched her face change in a way I will never forget. She looked at the screen. Then she looked at me. Then she called her manager. And when she finally spoke, she said one sentence that made the floor feel like it had dropped away beneath my feet. I'll tell you what that sentence was. But first, I need to take you back to where all of this began, to a rainy Tuesday in November, a yellow house on Birchwood Lane, and the two people who turned out to have loved me far more carefully than I ever knew. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Hartford, Connecticut, in a house with a big oak tree in the front yard, and a kitchen that always smelled like something warm. I was adopted as an infant by Robert and Margaret Calloway, and for 23 years I never once felt the difference. My father read to me every night, long past the age when most kids would have found it embarrassing. He just liked the ritual of it, the sitting together in the lamplight before the world went quiet. My mother taught me to make butternut squash soup every October, standing shoulder to shoulder at the stove, and she always said the same thing while we stirred. Cooking is just another way of saying I love you, without having to find the words. That was the life they gave me. That was the home they built around me, until a drunk driver ran a red light on a wet November road, and in one moment they were both gone. The funeral home smelled like white lilies and candle wax, and I have never been able to walk past either without feeling it pull me back to that room. I arrived in the only black dress I owned, still numb, still unable to fully accept that the two people who had shaped everything I was lay in those caskets at the front. That was when Vivian stepped into my path. She was 7 years older than me, her dark hair perfectly set, her composure so complete it looked rehearsed. She looked at me with the particular calm of someone who had already made all the decisions, and said quietly, "You're in the third row. The front is for family." The words landed before I fully understood them. "But Vivian, She didn't let me finish. "Immediate family, Stella." Across the room, Aunt Catherine rose from her seat and began walking toward us, her expression tight. Vivian turned just slightly and said, low enough that only I could hear, "Aunt Catherine, please don't make today any harder than it already is. Mom and Dad would understand." Aunt Catherine stopped. She looked at me, and what I saw in her face was not agreement. It was helplessness, and sorrow, and apology all at once. She sat back down, and I understood, standing there alone in that aisle, that no one was coming to stand beside me today. I walked to the third row by myself. A woman I had never met patted my shoulder and said something about the poor adopted girl. I didn't answer. I just kept my eyes on the caskets and asked the only question I had left. Did they know it would end up like this? After the service ended, and people were gathering themselves to leave, Aunt Catherine found me near the exit. She took both my hands in hers and held on, her voice urgent and low. "Stella, listen to me. Do not throw away anything your parents gave you, anything at all, no matter how small, no matter how insignificant it looks. Do you understand me?" I didn't understand. Not then. I couldn't have known what she suspected, or what she was trying to protect. But I nodded, and I kept those words close, because 6 years later, they turned out to be the only thing standing between me and losing everything a second time. The funeral was over, but the pain was just getting started. 3 days after we buried my parents, The phone rang. I was sitting at the kitchen table in the house I had grown up in, still wearing the same grief like a second skin, when I heard a man's voice on the other end, introducing himself as Edward Hargrove, my father's attorney. He was calling to confirm my attendance at the will reading scheduled for the following morning. Before I could say a single word, Vivian walked into the kitchen, crossed the room in 4 steps, and took the phone directly out of my hand. Not asked. Took. She smiled the way she always smiled when she had already decided how things were going to go. "Mr. Hargrove, this is Vivian Calloway Marsh." "Yes, my sister won't be attending. She isn't named in the will." A brief pause. "Thank you so much for your time." She ended the call and set the phone down on the counter, then turned to me with an expression of perfect, practiced calm. "You don't need to be there, Stella." I felt something rise up in my chest, something that had been quiet for too long. "You don't have the right to make that decision for me." She tilted her head slightly, the way you do when you're explaining something obvious to someone you've already written off. "The law gives me that right, Stella, not feelings." She walked out of the kitchen, and I stood there alone, with the sound of my own heartbeat filling the silence she left behind. That night, I couldn't sleep. Somewhere around midnight, I got up to get a glass of water and noticed a thin line of light coming from under the living room door. I pushed it open just slightly. Vivian was sitting in my father's armchair with a glass of red wine, staring at nothing. Her face wasn't triumphant. It wasn't cold. It was empty, hollowed out, exhausted, carrying something that almost looked like pain. For just a moment, she looked like a person. Then she turned and saw me standing in the doorway. And just like that, the mask came back. I closed the door quietly and went back to my room. That was the moment I accepted something I had been avoiding for years. The sister I had tried so hard to love had stopped being someone I recognized a long time ago. The next evening, Vivian came home from the attorney's office. She walked into the kitchen, dropped a plain white envelope on the counter between us, not placed, dropped, and said without looking at me, "The lawyer found this with your name on it, probably empty. Consider it a parting gift." Then she walked away. I picked up the envelope. Inside was a single bank card with my name on it. I almost left it there on the counter. Then I remembered what Aunt Catherine had told me, "Don't throw away anything your parents gave you," and I slipped it into my pocket. The following morning, Vivian appeared in my bedroom doorway with her arms folded and told me I had 36 hours to be out of the house. "I've already been more than generous," she said. I spent the next several hours on the phone, calling every relative I could think of, aunts, uncles, cousins, anyone who might offer me even a couch to sleep on for a few days. The responses came back one after another, each one a little more devastating than the last. A distant cousin told me flatly, "Vivian already told us what happened. You tried to claim half the house even though you were adopted." "That's not right, Stella," an uncle said. "Don't make things harder for Vivian right now. She's the one who lost her parents." By the 5th call, I understood exactly what had happened. Vivian had gotten there first. She had called every single person before I had a chance to, and she had told them her version of events so thoroughly and so convincingly that my version didn't stand a chance. When I reached Aunt Catherine, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to help you, sweetheart. I really do. But your uncle says we can't get involved." She paused, and I could hear her trying not to cry. "You remember what I told you, don't you? Don't throw anything away." It was the only help she was able to give me. I kept packing. I was in my bedroom pulling things from the closet when Vivian walked in. She looked around the room slowly, then picked up the last family photograph sitting on my dresser, the 4 of us together, taken at Thanksgiving 2 years before the accident. She held it for a moment, looked at it without expression, and dropped it into the black garbage bag she was holding. Something in me snapped. "That's mine." She looked at me with the flattest eyes I have ever seen. "This is my house. Everything in it belongs to me." I reached into the bag and pulled the photograph out. I held it against my chest and didn't say another word. It was the one thing I refused to leave behind. An hour later, a locksmith arrived. Neighbors watched through their windows. A teenager across the street stood on the sidewalk filming on his phone. Vivian followed me out onto the front porch and said, loudly enough for everyone within earshot to hear, I don't have any obligation to someone who isn't my real family. I walked down the driveway with a suitcase in one hand, a garbage bag in the other, and a photograph pressed under my arm. The bank card was still in my pocket, and for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I didn't throw it away. I walked away from that house with everything I owned in 2 bags, and I told myself that was the end of it, but some endings take years to settle into. I found a studio apartment in a working-class neighborhood in Hartford that I could afford on a barista's wages if I was careful. The walls were so thin, I could hear my neighbor's television every night through the drywall. The heater worked about half the time. The window in the kitchen had been painted shut by someone years before me and never opened all the way, so in summer, the room held heat like an oven, and in winter, cold crept in through the edges, no matter how many towels I pressed against the frame. But it was mine. I paid for it myself, and no one could take it from me. I worked 2 jobs for the first 2 years. I was at the coffee shop by 5 in the morning, and by 3 in the afternoon I walked 4 blocks to a restaurant where I washed dishes until midnight. I ate staff meals. I bought whatever produce was marked down at the end of the day. I didn't buy a single piece of new clothing for almost 2 years. Some nights I was so exhausted I sat on the edge of my mattress and couldn't remember if I had eaten dinner. The bank card sat in the nightstand drawer, untouched. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. But the truth was simpler and harder than that. I was afraid. Because if I walked into a bank and that card turned out to be empty, it would mean Vivian had been right about everything. It would mean I had never really been their daughter at all. So I left it in the drawer and kept working. Exhaustion was easier than the truth. The darkest night came in my second winter there. The heater gave out completely sometime around 11, and I sat on the floor with my coat on and a thin blanket around my shoulders, holding my cracked phone for warmth more than anything else. I opened a social media app out of habit, and the first thing I saw was a photo Vivian had posted, a sun-drenched hillside in Tuscany, the kind of place that looks like it belongs in a travel magazine. The caption read, "Mom and Dad would have loved it here." I stared at those words for a long moment. Then I turned the screen off and sat in the dark and the cold, and thought the thought I had been fighting for 2 years. If they really loved me, how did they let this happen? I almost got up and opened that drawer. Almost. But I stayed on the floor instead, because I was more afraid of knowing than I was of not knowing. And that fear kept me exactly where I was. My coworker Joanna was the one small light in those years. She never pushed, never pried. When I told her once, quietly, that I didn't have any family, she just nodded and made sure I always had something to eat on our shared shifts. Small kindness. The kind that keeps you going when nothing else does. By the 3rd year, things had shifted slightly. I was promoted to shift supervisor at the coffee shop. I quit the restaurant job, and I got health insurance for the first time in my adult life. It wasn't much, but it was something I had built entirely on my own, and I held on to that. It was sometime in that 3rd year that I saw a photo online of my childhood home, freshly renovated, new windows, new paint, flower beds that my mother would have chosen herself. The comments were full of people congratulating Vivian on what a beautiful job she had done. Beneath one of the photos, Aunt Catherine had written simply, "I wish Stella could see this." The comment was gone within 10 minutes. Then, early in the 4th year, a thick cream-colored envelope appeared in my mailbox. The return address was a law office. The letter inside said there were assets designated specifically for me, that the matter was urgent, and that I needed to make contact immediately. I read it twice, standing at the mailbox in the cold. Then I folded it up, walked inside, and dropped it in the trash. It had to be a scam. There was no other explanation that made sense to me then. 3 weeks later, a voicemail appeared on my phone from a man named Edward Hargrove. His voice was steady and unhurried, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has learned to be patient over a long career. He said he had been a close friend of my father's for 30 years. He said my father had asked him to protect me. He said Vivian had told him I moved abroad and wanted no contact with anyone from my past, and that he had never believed her. He asked me to please call him back. I stood in my small kitchen at 2 in the morning and listened to that message 7 times in a row. My hands were shaking, and it had nothing to do with the cold. I saved the voicemail, but I didn't call, because if it was real, it meant I had spent 4 years suffering through something that didn't have to happen, and if it wasn't, I would fall apart completely. Either way, I wasn't ready. So I set the phone down, went back to bed, and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling until morning came. I had spent 5 years learning how to stop hoping, and then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning at work, hope found me anyway. Joanna came rushing through the back door of the coffee shop 10 minutes into our shift, still catching her breath, phone already extended toward me. Her boyfriend worked in real estate, she said, and he had flagged a property in the Hartford County foreclosure auction listings that morning, a house on Birchwood Lane, with a debt of $430,000 attached to it, owner listed as Callaway Marsh. She remembered me mentioning that name once, years ago, in passing. She hadn't forgotten. I took the phone from her and looked at the listing photo. The house I grew up in, the yellow house with the oak tree out front where my father had once pushed me on a rope swing, looked like it had been abandoned. The paint was peeling in long strips from the siding. One corner of the front porch had collapsed inward. The garden my father had tended every spring and summer, the one where he grew tomatoes and roses and called it his small piece of heaven on earth, was now a tangle of waist-high weeds that had swallowed everything whole. I stood there looking at that photo for a long moment, and something shifted quietly in my chest. Vivian hadn't loved that house. She had only ever wanted to make sure I couldn't have it. And once it no longer served that purpose, she had simply let it rot. That night I stood in front of my nightstand for a long time. Then, for the first time in 6 years, I opened the drawer. The card was still there, exactly where I had left it, small and plain and ordinary, the kind of thing you would look at and never guess held anything at all. I picked it up, held it, and made a decision. Monday morning, I walked into Heritage Trust Bank and told myself the whole way there that this was simple. I was going to hand over the card, close whatever account was attached to it, and walk back out into the cold air a few minutes later with one less thing connecting me to the past. That was the plan. Diane Foster was the teller who took my card. She was professional and unhurried right up until the moment she typed the number into her system. Then she stopped. She typed something else. Stopped again. When she looked up at me, her expression had changed in a way I couldn't quite read. She said, very carefully, "Could I see your ID, please?" I handed it over. She studied it, looked at me, looked at her screen, and then picked up her phone and called her manager, without another word to me. The manager came out from the back, stood beside Diane, and they both looked at the screen together in silence for several seconds. Nobody spoke. The sound of the bank around me, keyboards, quiet conversations, the hum of the overhead lights, felt suddenly very far away. Diane turned to face me. She said the card I had handed her was not a standard debit card. It was an activation key for a private trust account, established 6 years ago by Robert and Margaret Callaway, structured completely outside of the estate and outside of the will, designed so that only I could access it, and only by appearing in person at a bank branch with that card. The principal amount was $5.2 million. With 6 years of accumulated interest, the total current value was $5.7 million. I heard the numbers, I understood them individually, but they didn't connect into anything real for me, not yet. Then Diane reached beneath the counter and slid a sealed envelope across to me. The paper had gone slightly yellow with age. The seal was still intact, and on the front, in my mother's handwriting, the same careful, familiar script I had grown up watching fill grocery lists and birthday cards and notes tucked into my school lunches, were the words, "To our daughter Stella. Mom and Dad love you forever." I looked at those words and my hands stopped shaking. Everything stopped. Because that was the first time in 6 years that anyone had called me their daughter, even if the person writing it was no longer here to say it out loud. I opened the envelope at the counter. The letter inside was 4 pages long, written in my mother's steady hand, with my father's signature at the bottom, shakier than I remembered it. The pen pressed harder than necessary, like a man trying to make sure the words stayed. My parents had known. They had known exactly what Vivian was capable of, had watched it develop over years, had tried to redirect it and couldn't. The law required them to leave the house to their eldest child. They had no way around that. But they had found another way. They had protected me in secret, building something Vivian could never touch, designing it so that only my physical presence could unlock it. The letter said, "This is not charity. This is not guilt. This is love. You are our daughter. Not because of biology, but because we chose you, every single day, for 23 years. And then, in my father's shakier hand at the very bottom of the last page, one final line. I am sorry I could not be there to protect you myself. But I did everything I could. You are my daughter, forever. I folded the letter closed. I sat down in the chair beside Diane's desk, and I cried in the middle of that bank, in front of strangers, without any attempt to stop myself or explain. Diane set a box of tissues on the desk beside me and didn't say a word. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in years. I left that bank with a letter pressed against my chest, and 6 years of doubt finally beginning to loosen their grip. And the first call I made was to Edward Hargrove. He picked up on the second ring, as if he had been waiting by the phone for exactly this moment. He told me everything. Vivian had contacted him the week after the funeral and told him I had moved abroad and wanted no contact with the family or the estate. When he pushed back, she threatened to file a harassment complaint against his firm. He hadn't believed her, but every address he found for me turned out to be outdated, every phone number disconnected. What I understood, hearing that, was something I hadn't fully named before. I hadn't just been pushed out of a house. I had been erased. Every time I moved because I couldn't make rent. Every time I lost a phone because I couldn't pay the bill. Vivian's story about me had held a little more easily. I had disappeared without meaning to, and she had let it happen without lifting a finger to stop it. When Edward finished, I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, I want to buy the house back. He didn't hesitate. I'll make the arrangements today. The foreclosure auction was held in a conference room at the county courthouse. Metal folding chairs, cold fluorescent lighting, the low hum of an air conditioning unit that had been running too long. I arrived early and chose a seat in the back row. I was wearing a navy blazer I had found at a thrift store 2 years earlier, and my mother's pearl earrings, the ones I had pulled from that garbage bag on the day I was thrown out, the only piece of her I had managed to hold on to. I sat quietly and watched the room fill. Real estate investors with clipboards, a young couple holding hands, and then Vivian and Brandon came through the door and took seats in the front row. Vivian looked like a version of herself that had been left out in the weather. Her makeup was uneven, her hair not quite the way it used to be, her shoulders carrying a weight that designer clothes couldn't hide. Brandon sat beside her without looking at her, his eyes moving around the room like a man already calculating his exit. The bidding opened at $350,000 and climbed steadily. 370, 400, 420, 440. I waited. When the room began to slow and the auctioneer paused to survey the remaining bidders, I raised my hand and said clearly, 500,000. The room went quiet in a way that felt total, like sound itself had stopped to pay attention. Vivian turned around. The moment she saw my face, something moved through her expression in rapid succession. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and then something that cracked wide open. Stella, her voice broke on the single word. How are you? Where did you get? The auctioneer reminded her firmly to please hold her comments until the auction concluded. One remaining bidder pushed back with 520,000. I didn't pause. 650,000. Silence again. The auctioneer looked around the room one full time. No one moved. Sold to the woman in the back row for $650,000. The gavel came down, and the sound it made was the cleanest, most final thing I had ever heard. I stood up and said, calmly and loud enough to carry, that house is where my parents raised me. The money I used to buy it came from them, the inheritance they set aside for their adopted daughter. Across the room, Brandon stood up, walked to the door, and left without once looking back at his wife. Vivian watched him go. Then she looked at me. Then she looked down at her own hands. It was the first time I had ever seen her look like someone who understood, fully and without any escape left, what she had done. She caught up with me in the hallway outside. "You can't do this," she said. Her voice was unsteady in a way I had never heard before. "That was our parents' house." I looked at her evenly. "It isn't yours anymore." She took a breath that sounded like it cost her something. "I'm sorry, Stella. I was scared. I didn't know how to handle any of it after they died." I said, "You knew exactly what you wanted to do. And you did it." Then I walked away. Not in anger, not in triumph, just lighter than I had felt in 6 years. The following day, Aunt Catherine came to the house and sat with me in one of the empty rooms, the afternoon light coming through the dirty windows in long, pale rectangles. She told me that once the truth about the trust had spread through the family, people had begun to quietly remember things they had chosen not to see: the seating at the funeral, the deleted comments, the calls that were never returned. "We believed what was easier to believe," she said, her voice unsteady. "And I am so sorry for that." I didn't say anything. I just put my hand over hers and let the silence hold what words couldn't. A month later, Vivian appeared at the fence line on a gray afternoon, thinner than I remembered, wearing clothes that didn't fit right anymore. Brandon had filed for divorce the week after the auction. She told me she had been sleeping in her car. She said, "I'm your sister. I don't have anyone left." I looked at her for a long moment. "6 years ago, you told me I wasn't family," I said. "You said it clearly, in front of our neighbors, for anyone who wanted to hear it. I believed you then. I'm choosing to believe you now." She began to raise her voice. Threats, then pleas, cycling back and forth. But I had already turned back to the garden and was pulling weeds from the flower bed my father had planted 30 years ago. When I looked up again, she was gone. I didn't know if I would ever see her again. I found, to my own quiet surprise, that I was at peace with not knowing. In the closet of my old bedroom, I found a water-damaged shoebox that Vivian had somehow missed. Inside were photographs: me as a newborn wrapped in a yellow blanket, me as 5 years old covered in flour from baking with my mother, me at 12 on my father's shoulders at a county fair, me at 18 in my cap and gown, with both my parents crying openly behind me, and at the bottom, a photo of all 4 of us taken at Thanksgiving the year before the accident. Vivian's hand was resting on my shoulder. She was smiling. A real smile. Unguarded and easy. I stared at her face in that photograph for a long time and tried to find the moment when that person had become someone else. I couldn't find it. Maybe no one could. 6 months later, the house looked the way it was always supposed to. Warm cream paint on the exterior, new windows that caught the late afternoon light, a garden full of roses and tomatoes and basil along the back fence. That evening, Aunt Catherine and Joanna, and a handful of people I had built my life around, came through the front door and filled the rooms with noise and warmth and the smell of good food. The photograph of all 4 of us, Robert, Margaret, Vivian, and me, was hanging on the wall near the entryway. Aunt Catherine noticed it and asked, quietly, why I had kept it. I looked at it for a moment before I answered. "Because it reminds me that the first 23 years of my life were real," I said. "I don't need to erase the past to move forward. I just need to choose, carefully, who deserves to be part of what comes next." That night, for the first time in 6 years, the house on Birchwood Lane was full of laughter, and I was exactly where I belonged.